Thanks, Gerard, for that introduction. Yeah, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to tell you a bit more about what we do. And I definitely agree that there's, as you'll see through the scope of this talk, hopefully, that there's still great opportunities for expanding on this work. Africa is a massive continent. Right. So first, just a bit about SANBI. SANBI is a national research infrastructure very similar to the data center. We do, however, have quite a broad mandate. We manage national gardens, etc. as well. But in terms of information management and research, our mandate states that we should be collecting, generating, processing, and coordinating and disseminating information related to biodiversity. And obviously that we need to hold databases in that regard. And it is not simply just a mandate to accumulate data, that very specifically our mandate also speaks to the need to coordinate, enable, and undertake research ourselves. So we are a research institution as well as we coordinate research throughout the country. We also need to perform national assessments and monitoring, very similar to what you saw earlier this morning. But also critically, we need to provide policy advice to government about how to better manage biodiversity into the future, and that is all levels of government. And effectively, sort of that takes us out of the realm just of conservation and into the work of other government sectors and departments, where part of that the policy advice that we provide are on strategies to reduce the loss of biodiversity. So that takes us into land use planning, EIAs, other economic sectors. To protect biodiversity, and that's mainly focused obviously within the conservation sector itself, and also to restore biodiversity, natural resource management, etc., as well. So that is quite a broad mandate that we have, and that requires quite a lot of foundational data to be, or to underpin that. And obviously, as SANBI is a national institution, but that's impossible, I think, for any national institution globally to do on their own. So we have a multitude of partners, 27 major organizations, right, that provide us with a wealth of data, of which only a subset gets published to GBIF. So there you can see we also work with citizen science. We ourselves manage the National Herbarium, but we are connected to 75 other herbaria throughout the country, museums, etc., that all feed information into SANBI. And very critically there at the bottom as well, you can see we do quite a lot of spatial analysis and prioritization alongside our partners, and that information we also serve free and open access for anybody in the country or globally to use to support their work. Right. We also coordinate national programs, largely through funding provided by the Department of Science and Technology, and in particular our head of delegations, part of that department, where the Foundational Biodiversity Information Program is really the biggest natural science grant-making facility in the country that supports research projects with a focus on ones that will generate data. Right. And the second one is our own national sort of version of DISCO, which is a virtual collections institution that we are in the process of constructing in the country. And together those two programs will, over the next 2 years, deliver over 1 million records, which effectively, if you look at our current output to GBIF, our annual output stands to double that. And we're already sort of at the peak of what we've been able to publish to GBIF. So, all of these things really, I'm just highlighting the varied role that we play in South Africa as an institution and as an infrastructure, but very purposefully sort of to provide policy advice. Right? So, but then just a reminder, sort of that might all look good or not to you, but South Africa, I just need to remind everyone, is a developing country. Right? So how is it that we are able to attract that level of funding, especially from, as I highlighted, those national programs that we run, when the trend globally, I think, is for the conservation sector to be defunded. Right? We are a mega diverse country. I think that helps. We've got a range of biomes in the country, 3 global biodiversity hotspots, the third most diverse biodiverse country in the world. But the reality is that we're also a country facing massive socioeconomic pressures. If you look at us in relation to who we consider to be some of our sort of global peers, we've got a lower GDP per capita than our peers. And also we've got a vastly higher unemployment rate. And South Africa, as it stands, is still the country in the world with the largest Gini coefficient. So we've got the biggest wealth gap between sort of the haves and the have-nots, and that is growing. Right? So how do you make the case for biodiversity in a country where we actually still have quite a lot of primary biodiversity left? Everything that you see on green on that slide is still natural or near natural. Right? How do you get people to take biodiversity as being important when really these are the key government priorities, right? To economic growth, to obviously unlock jobs, to reduce the wealth gap, and to provide access to basic services, water and sanitation, electricity, to a large portion of our society that doesn't enjoy the benefits of those services yet. That's really where the money should be going. Right. And we have been successful. I'm not going to belabor sort of that. If there are any questions on the details of this, I can speak to that later. But I just want to highlight that we'd like to think that we have figured out a way of attracting that investment and for government to take biodiversity seriously, because we are currently on the cusp of declaring an additional 4.5% of our marine exclusive economic zone as a protected area, to go from 0.5% as it currently stands to 5%, which is an absolutely massive increase. And this was done through a massive government program that is focused on expanding South Africa's oceans economy, right? So, through a program fundamentally directed towards economic growth, we've managed to increase or might be increasing our protected area state to 5% very shortly. And the rest of this presentation just sort of deals with that theory of change and is really what we are looking at supporting our peers throughout the continent in doing. Right, so this is basically the challenge. If we look at the biodiversity sector and sort of practitioners in the country, if you ask them, why is biodiversity important? The odds are that they are going to give you answers in line with those cascading points that you see there. And I see our film crew from yesterday are smiling because I do actually want to ask the question for the GBIF participants who were interviewed yesterday and asked exactly that question. Sort of, is this the pattern of thought that played out? And I bet it is, right? Yeah, right. Whereas if we look at government sector, and Kieran, etc., are probably best placed to answer this. If they ask the question, why should we invest money into biodiversity? The odds are that they address that in the reverse, but also with slight nuances. That they look at the question they ask is, what is the socioeconomic value to people for investing in biodiversity, etc., etc. And at some point we do meet, and that has typically been, for example, around the heritage and cultural value of species, etc., that fund programs around recording biodiversity and so on. But that really isn't enough to turn the ship around, as was mentioned by a couple of speakers earlier, about really making an impact into whether it's the Millennium Development Goals or the SDGs or the Aichi targets, etc., etc. Right? It isn't really enough to have systemic change. So I think from both sides, what we need to do more is to sort of move outside of our comfort zones and engage really meaningfully, right? And to align our priorities, not just sort of reframe our priorities in speak that we think appeals or appeases each other. Moving forward. So that's really our value proposition and theory of change. It is really one about mainstreaming biodiversity that goes back to COP5, ecosystem approach, etc., as was mentioned earlier. And I think the key thing for everybody to realize is that this is not just something that you can do once off, right? There's no such thing as a light touch mainstreaming intervention. It really is getting in there and changing the way that we work. And you need to do that with a long-term vision in mind, but also in a way that delivers short-term results, because you ideally convince people about a new way of doing things with sort of showing change in the short term. And what is that based on? It's firstly based on good science, right? So we need, and good science is underpinned by good data. So all of the work that this community does, that GBIF does, etc., at our national levels and at the global levels around developing indicators, etc., and the move to make that more transparent and improve the quality of it is fundamental to this work. But I think bringing it back to a national level, what really makes an impact is where we are able to link that to the country's development objectives, or at a regional scale to that region's development objectives. And as I said, it's not just about sort of spinning it in language that you think works. It's really figuring out how does biodiversity support the objectives of our community. Right, and the example that I highlighted earlier on marine protected areas is exactly how we figured out how to do that, about how protected areas serve as spawning grounds, for example, that sustains fisheries that are a key component of our economy, etc. So you really need to figure out real links to your development objectives, and then to develop deep and thick relationships of trust. Right? The science is all good, but as I think Don highlighted earlier, that what you really need to take this work forward is you need champions in institutions, right? And those champions don't sit there just in isolation. That champions work with other champions, etc. And these relationships need to be sustained and maintained, right? And then a lot of the work that we do, we have to recognize sort of. Doesn't necessarily come from a 20-year plan. Sometimes windows of opportunity just open up. A new government department gets formed, or a new head of state comes along that opens a door that wasn't open for 50 years. You need to be ready to pounce on those opportunities together and make the most of them. Right? And then you need to develop good quality tools. And I don't just mean snazzy brochures, etc., but really tools that are couched in the language of the sector that you are trying to work with, that are obviously defensible and relatively mature, and can stay the course. I see it in many instances that countries develop a new tool every 5 years for every purpose that comes along. You need, if you want to make change in the way governments work, you need a level of policy traction. Things need to stay the same for a certain amount of time. Right? And ultimately, you need systemic change throughout all levels. There's no use just intervening at the top or just intervening at a technocratic level. You need to strengthen processes by working on those government processes, the people within those processes, and the systems themselves. And this is a massive task. So we've definitely not cracked this, but we've seen sufficient results that this works. Right. And so why take this work into the rest of the continent, you might ask? And from our perspective as South Africa, because we're all in this together, right? We, at a very sort of physical level, we share many trans-frontier conservation initiatives with our neighbors. Definitely the health of our ecosystems, ecosystem services, etc., are intrinsically tied to the well-being of our neighbors, but also we're all bound together by global issues. I think we've all had a very good introduction to meteorology this morning that just showed us how real that is, right? And then this feeds into the Department of Science and Technology's strategy for working across the continent as well. But also sort of at a technocratic level, the biggest risk that we face in Africa is fragmentation. Our countries are vast and institutionally quite siloed. I think GBIF got a good taste of that as well in the bid project application process, where you would get the same application more or less from two different institutions in the same country that weren't aware of each other. And we find that all the time, even in a relatively well-resourced country like ours, that there's still a lot of institutional blindness. And what that means is that people reinvent the wheel, that there's, people struggle with the same problems endlessly, and there's just a lot of inefficiency, which is compounded by the fact that individually our country capacity is quite low. Right? Whether you look at sort of the actual resources available to manage nodes and how nodes operate, or the distributed expertise amongst institutions in museums, et cetera, in our countries. There are very few data scientists around in the biodiversity sector in our country and on our continent. And then also many of the countries struggle with strategic engagement like I outlined now, where scientists engage policymakers, et cetera. Most of our nodes, in fact, are even quite isolated, right? Right, and then I think finally, because there is a bit of a moral imperative as well for us as South Africa to take this work forward. We do have relatively better capacity than most of our peers. There are very few countries in the world, I think, even that have institutions, national institutions with a government mandate like SANBI or the Data Center or Conabio in Mexico. And that does mean that we have a level of sustainability that many other countries often don't have. So this value chain we've been thinking about for quite a while in the GBIF context, and it was really at a conference that we held in 2015 with GBIF and through JRS funding, where this really got embedded with most of the country participants, where we came out with a manifesto of sorts about the direction that we want to go towards, and this really laid the bedrock for the establishment of an Africa coordinating mechanism within GBIF, which I think is quite novel in terms of the regional other regions within GBIF, and you can see there that these objectives basically speak to that theory of change that I outlined earlier, where obviously the foundation of it is to mobilize data, but it really focuses on the capacity to deliver that data across that whole value chain, right? To build institutional capacity, and then to work on regional engagement strategies to make that link more to our development imperatives. Right? And critically, to establish communities of practice in country as well as across the continent, to help us address that sort of institutional silo effect that I was talking about earlier. Right. So the first part of that is that we need to improve our capacity for data management and for research throughout Africa. Right. That graph there just shows of all of the data published to GBIF about Africa, most of that, just over half of it, is published by institutions in the rest of the world. So Africa only publishes less than half of African data. Now, this is not a sort of nationalistic argument I want to put forward here. We definitely want everybody globally to keep on the research that they're doing and to publish data about Africa. But it is quite critical that if you do want to have countries self-actualize, that you do need to build internal capacity. Right, and that graph is also very misleading because on the continent, more than 97% of the data published about Africa by Africa and institutions is actually published by South African institutions. Right, so that also holds massive implications. So if you look at something like the IPBES Africa assessment, sort of where the bulk of the expertise and the data actually comes from, that sort of bias needs to be corrected. So there is a big need for investing in the rest of the continent. And we've basically are going about implementing this theory of change through three projects that I'll just go through quickly. The first one is around mobilizing data. It's funded by the JRS Biodiversity Foundation, but the purpose of it isn't really to mobilize data. It's about mobilizing or building the capacity to identify and then mobilize policy-relevant data. Right? And it was quite key in that project that data suppliers, so the academics that are, or museums, etc., that are mobilizing the data, need to enter into that project with the policymakers in hand who have expressed what they need the data for. And that, doing that right off the bat with the project is not as easy as it sounds. So this isn't perfect at this point, but the main aim here was to change the way that we go about projects. And then the second novelty about this project is that nobody got money up front. Typically with a research grant, you get your money up front and then you use that to fund your research. This is a competition about who can mobilize the most data and embed that data the best into an NBSAP or a regional strategy or whatever the case may be. And what this does is it actually forces people to work together. If you don't have any resources, your two best resources are creativity and collaboration. Right? And at the end, participants will get prize money. Everybody will get some money. But that prize money isn't enough to cover the costs of actually engaging in the project. That is just sufficient funds to generate new projects and hopefully to sustain this way of working. And this project has been successful beyond anybody's wildest imagination. I mean, the funder got involved with this because it was novel. They didn't expect that it was going to work. And we are about a month away from the prize-giving ceremony, and everybody has performed spectacularly. Right? So that's to do with mobilizing data. Then the second part is around scientific assessment, where we are implementing a project, again, with 4 countries that really focuses on developing the in-country technical capacity to conduct red list assessments. Most of the assessments that have been conducted throughout Africa have been done by other agencies coming in and doing the work through sort of a national agency, etc. This is really about empowering African scientists to conduct these assessments. Right. And then the final project, again with 4 countries, are then to take that sort of assessment information forward and really embedding it in national priorities. So with UNEP WCMC, we developed a publication a couple of years ago called Mapping Biodiversity Priorities, and through the CBD Secretariat, we actually received further funding to run this project and to now trial it with a couple of countries. So this is really about doing national level rapid assessments and priority settings. There will be GIS and policy analysis capacity development that happens as well, so really to strengthen that chain. And importantly, because of the issue that I highlighted earlier with data, this methodology is really designed for countries that are data poor. We've tested it in data poor regions in South Africa. We're pretty confident that this approach does work in other countries, or will work in other countries as well. Right. And those 3 projects really sort of are just the starting point of making the case for that value chain and getting people comfortable with working in that way. And as I said earlier, the scope for further exploration and scaling up of these kinds of interventions is definitely there. But the essential components of it is that you need to mobilize essential data sets, work those into assessment, and ultimately take both of those things together further into prioritization that informs actions in national policies, etc., that ultimately hopefully find spatial expression. I mean, that's the thing about biodiversity. Any piece of biodiversity can be located spatially in time and both in time and space in the world. And if you really want to make an impact on in government policy, it's not just about having it there in words. We actually need to have spatial prioritization there as well. Right. So ultimately, for us, the question was raised yesterday about sort of what's the value of 1 billion records in GBIF, and this is partly the answer. Right. Those records on their own, are meaningless, and we don't just want to mobilize data for data's sake. It has to have meaning, and this value chain is just sort of what we're busy doing in our part of the world. Right. Thank you.